Houston, we have a problem.
We copy on the ground. We got a bunch of guys about to turn loose.
All right, so let's begin with a question, and that question is, what is the point of this video? So, the point is that I think there are so many quotes, and so many, that tell us that we've all been lied to. Now, despite the current debate over the shape of the earth, the first step to waking someone up is showing them that we've all been lied to. So if I'm able to show that all of the real science and many of the greatest minds of all time, quote unquote, agree that all tests show that the earth is fixed, well, would you then realize that there's a problem? I hope so. I just want to show people what exactly led me to the understanding that for me is so clear, that the current scientific establishment has a certain worldview, and that worldview says that we cannot be in a central position in the universe, and the quotes will prove just that. That observationally, they cannot say that we are not the center, that they make their choices on philosophical grounds, and some of them say based on, quote-unquote, modesty. It's not science. That is known as a worldview, and it steers their science and their observations in a direction, and people deserve to know that. It is the absolute definition of pseudoscience. It's being taught as actual science, and it's absolutely far from it. So, because in my opinion, it should show you what is going on and what we're dealing with, but really it's up to you. You've got to decide what to believe. So, in my opinion, the entirety of astronomy and cosmology is actually built upon this mediocrity assumption, this worldview that Earth cannot be central, it cannot be important, we must be no different than the lights in the sky. It's full of presuppositions, assumptions, begging the question, and in actuality, it's all just pseudoscience. But my hope is simple here. By the end of this video, you can realize that we are not taught everything, but we're just taught a one-sided, convoluted, concocted model that's built on assumptions and philosophical beliefs, and that any and all observations that show otherwise get buried or explained away using, of course, mathematics, metaphysical theories that allow them to keep this worldview and to maintain their status as the heliocentric, quote-unquote, geniuses that they are. And the choice is yours, to see them that way or to see them as I do, as priests of a religion who have devised clever explanations and basically mathematical, formulas to hide the truth from you, me, and the entire world. So just imagine for a second, maybe close your eyes if you want to get in touch with your inner self, and think for a second, if you realized today that the earth was in fact still, that it was in fact fixed and of prime importance, if it was the apple of God's eye per se, would that change your worldview? Well, it absolutely did mine. It changed my entire life and my world profoundly. So my hope is that you hear these quotes and decide for yourself if you'd like to continue the belief centered around these forced explanations of these men to explain these anomalies, or if by chance, maybe you now realize, like I do, what's actually going on. And maybe you open your mind for possibly the first time to what is a myriad of other possibilities and various conceptions and ideas that better explain the world that we live in. So the choice will truly become your own, and you aren't cornered into a belief system that is taught to children before they can even understand or possibly question the worldview that is about to become part of their belief system. I think nothing is important as where you live, right? If the earth is central and of the utmost importance, then I believe all humans deserve to know that and to operate their lives within that enormously important understanding. So let's get to the quotes. There are many more than I've assembled here today, so many more. I just tried to maybe touch a little bit of everything and tried to corral them. But I'm only pointing to quotes about this particular worldview and subject, so I won't be reading quotes today about the earth being flat. You won't hear any quotes like that. You won't hear any evolution quotes. You won't hear quotes about the age of dinosaurs or those kind of things. Nope. Today is just going to be about the earth. We're going to be looking at the earth, its location in the cosmos, its centrality, its fixed position, and the tests and opinions regarding relativity and why it is that all tests, at least all tests that I've been able to find, prove that the earth does not move. So in the end, when you hear the quotes and contrast them with what you were taught and what's being taught to our children, and your grandchildren, perhaps then maybe you will see the issue and understand why so many of us are absolutely against what's going on and what's being taught. So the truth is that it is not science, it's pseudoscience, it's not reality, it's a mathematical conception, and it's not fact, but simply it's theory. And if, it's not the correct view of the world, but rather it's like a worldview pushed onto everyone through public and also, social indoctrination, as we've seen of recent. So I've got my OneNote opened here where I keep all my notes, and we can start to go through some of them. And I'm sure that there are many, many more, like I said. So if I've missed some, or maybe you find a quote that I have missourced or something's wrong with it, please leave a quote in the comment or leave a comment saying that I did so. Or if you have any other quotes that maybe I didn't include that you want other people to see, you can leave those as a comment as well. And this way more people can see it. My quotes are kind of arranged in a way that makes it easy for me to kind of tell a story. So I'm going to get to those in a second. But before I start, I want to cover one thing that, seems to me that all heliocentric religious zealots want to try and tell me when I say that the earth does not move and that there's no tests that prove it. What do they always say? They say Foucault's pendulum. Well, you should notice that all of these quotes by Einstein and many others, not all the quotes because some are by Copernicus and people that were before Foucault, but I'm talking about all the quotes that I read that are after Foucault. Why would it be that Einstein would say that there's no experiment that can prove the earth moves if he knew about the Foucault's pendulum, which he absolutely did. He knew about the Foucault's pendulum. So that's one thing I think people miss or that they don't really quite understand about Foucault's pendulum. And if you don't know about it, we'll talk about it real quick just because it is the one answer that I get. Where, this Foucault's pendulum proves that the earth spins. Okay, let's talk about it real quick. So we have these pendulums everywhere, right? And these pendulums are basically attached to this presupposed spherical spinning earth, which supposedly rotates once every 24 hours. But the earth also goes around the sun once yearly, and the sun goes around the galaxy, and the galaxy goes around the universe at 2.2 million miles per hour. And these are all local motions. So somehow the Foucault pendulum ignores all the local motions but one. It only recognizes the spin of the earth. Well, the Foucault pendulum miraculously stays lined up with the rest of the universe. And some try and say that it's inertia, but what exactly is inertia? Nobody even knows. I'll get back to that real quick, but I do want to show you, if I can get this up here, 1 second. I do want to show you a live stream of a Foucault pendulum. Let's go over there. All right. So this is a live stream of the Foucault pendulum. I don't know where it's at, but where is this at? Ludwig University something, Geophysics, Department of Earth, Environmental Sciences. The web address is geophysics. I'll actually copy this and put it in the description, so if anybody wants to see this. But here you can see, and they've got these 24-hour snapshots, so you can see that the pendulum actually moves around this little thing. But here's the thing that people don't really recognize. Remember, how often does the earth spin? It spins, once a day, right? But no, you've got to do all these mathematical equations again. The definition of pseudoscience. Bring in these mathematical equations so that you can actually be correct. Because if you look here, the direction of the plane of oscillation of a pendulum with respect to the earth rotates with an angular speed proportional to the sine of its latitude. Thus, one at 45 degrees rotates every 1.4 days. And one at 30 degrees, which is about where I'm at, thereabouts, every 2 days. So it takes 2 days to rotate all the way around, but the earth takes 1 day. You can read a little bit further here. It says, so many people have found that the sine factor difficult to understand, which prompted Foucault to conceive the gyroscope in 1852. The gyroscope spinning rotor tracks. Oh, good. I was hoping that I didn't accidentally not bring you over. I did. Continuing what I was reading. We're here. A Foucault pendulum is tricky to set up because imprecise construction can cause additional veering, which masks the terrestrial effect. Air resistance damps the oscillation. So Foucault pendulums in museums usually incorporate an electromagnetic or other drive to keep the bob swinging. This is an absolute lie because it says usually. So what is there, a museum somewhere where the Foucault pendulum swings by itself forever? No, sorry. You need an electromagnetic drive to keep the bob swinging. You have to have a magnet underneath it to keep it going. That's how things work. You can't just spin a pendulum and it go forever. That's against the laws of motion. So anyway, this is just, I wanted to show you this nonsense here, and we'll talk further about it. But like I said, a lot of people will tell you that it's inertia that causes this to happen, but nobody even knows what inertia is. All explanations about inertia involve circular reasoning. Usually it'll sound something like this, like a body keeps doing what it's doing because it has inertia. Okay, so what is inertia? Well, inertia is the tendency of a body to keep moving. Okay, that's great. But why does it keep doing what it's doing? Well, because it has inertia. What? But what is inertia? Well, it's the tendency of a body to keep doing whatever it's doing. Okay, but why does it keep doing whatever it's doing? And so on and so forth. It's just circular reasoning. You'll never get an answer. So perhaps inertia is a universal property. That's possible. And if so, then the ether or the firmament could be the very source causing the Foucault pendulum and the Coriolis effect. And this is why people like Einstein and others can't use Foucault's pendulum as proof that the Earth spins. Hopefully you understand what I'm saying here. You might hear heliocentrists tell us that the entire atmosphere and everything in it, talking about birds, butterflies, clouds, balloons, planes, helicopters, whatever you want to say, are all magically velcroed somehow to the Earth, spinning perfectly in sync with its axial rotation, and it actually reduces its speed also. The atmosphere reduces its speed as you head towards the poles, so it's going 1,040 miles per hour at the pole, and as you walk north, it'll eventually be 0 miles per hour at the pole. That's what, of course, they tell us. But where does this atmosphere even stop spinning? At what altitude? Nobody knows. If we could get up in a balloon, let's say we all get in a balloon and we travel upwards to the upper limits of the atmosphere, what would happen up there? It's utter nonsense. I mean, to think that the atmosphere, the air, is somehow attached and totally synchronized to perfection from 1,040 miles per hour to 0, and yet somehow we have clouds, we have winds, they all blow in every direction. This is a problem, folks. This is pseudoscience by its very definition. It's never shown, never detected, never proven, or scientifically shown in any way. Just absurdities that are required to save the heliocentric model. Like you can add a little theory here and some math there, and you can continue to have people believe that your little worldviews are fact. And, I certainly don't agree with that at all. Basically, for me, heliocentricity is not even logically plausible, let alone irrefutable. It's a theory that we are taught is based on scientific data, but it's actually purely based on a series of assumptions that were built up over the last few hundred years. For example, many of the assertions regarding these astronomical distances between lights in the sky are completely invented, and they're put into calculations on the a priori assumption that the Earth must be revolving around the sun. While at the same time, these assumed distances have another function where they're used as some sort of, petitio principii device, to, indicate that the sun must be at the center because of that distance. Go figure. Here's an example of how it's done. We're told that the sun is too big to revolve around the Earth, right? But wait a minute. Isn't the sun's size determined in the first place by assuming how big it must have been in order for us to have a heliocentric model? Well, of course it is. Go figure. Other assumptions might include the alleged tilt of the Earth, the tilt of the Earth's axis at 23.5 degrees, an absolute desperately needed heliocentric variable that has no basis in the real world, where the sun simply orbits from the Tropic of Cancer to the Tropic of Capricorn annually. But of these tropic latitude lines, they're not tilted. They're at an angle of 0 degrees. Both circles are parallel to the equator. In fact, the very word tropic itself comes from the Greek term tropos, which means to turn, referring to the fact that the sun turns back at these lines and they aren't tilted in any way at all. Or the Earth supposedly darting around the sun at various speeds. It orbits, right, at a faster speed at the northern winter and a slower speed at the northern summer, then back faster again, back and forth. But somehow all of this alleged speed change remains unnoticeable. Well, of course they like to say, well, we don't feel constant motion or speed, and yet the Earth we are on is changing speeds constantly, basically at every single second. Sorry, I'm going to have to get a drink here already. All right, where was I? So, not to mention the fact that the moon is also being dragged around at exactly those same speed levels. It's just, I don't know. How could it be in full, complete synchronization with the wobbly Earth, despite being 250,000 miles away from it? It's all such nonsense. So, what do I have on the screen here? Let me get over here to OneNote. First, I did want to say thank you to the Super Chats. Somebody left one before we even got started. Leaf Eaters. Your work is great. I've been watching your videos since you began. I think you should repost some of your older videos for some of the newcomers. Very entertaining. You are an inspiration. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Rhino, just a regular guy who owns a P900 who wants to help shoot across the bay. Yes, I got you. That's going to come up fairly soon. I do have one observation I'm going to make at the canal as soon as I get my camera and before I take it to the Monterey Bay to do that observation. So, Rhino, I will let you know. Thank you very much for that super chat. I appreciate it. And if anybody else wants to send a super chat, I will read those in due time. But like I said, we're going to move over here to OneNote. Let's see here. Hopefully you can see my OneNote. I don't know. Oh, great. Why do you not see the text on the screen? 1 second. This could prove to be catastrophic. What is going on? There's no over here. Oh, there we go. Okay, I got it. Sorry. I had it on a blank page. That's probably why you couldn't see anything. So, okay, so we're just going to go through some of these quotes. I've kind of got them sectioned off. Please forgive me if I make any pronunciation errors or I don't say somebody's name right or get a word wrong. I'm only human. I don't proclaim to be perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I probably make more mistakes every minute than anyone else, to be honest. But let's go ahead and just start out with something simple. This is theoretical physicist Michio Kaku telling us about cosmology. Hopefully you can hear this, and I'm not sure you will be able to, but we'll go ahead and try it.
Usually in science, if we're off by a factor of 2 or a factor of 10, we call that horrible. We say something's wrong with the theory. We're off by a factor of 10. However, in cosmology, we're off by a factor of 10 to the 120. That is 1 with 120 zeros after it. This is the largest mismatch between theory and experiment in the history of science.
Okay, so thank you, Michio Kaku, and hopefully you heard that. I think it might have been a little on the quiet side, but yeah, he basically tells you right there that they're off by a factor of 10 to the 120th power in regards, and he says it's the largest mismatch in the history of science. Hopefully people get the importance of that quote and understand what we're dealing with, and then you can decide if these are really the people that you want telling you where you live when they just admitted to be off by the largest factor in the history of science when you're looking at experiments versus theory. That's because the experiments do not show at all what these theories are that they've been telling us about the universe forever. And I described it last night, but I thought I just mentioned it again real quick before we get to some of these other ones, that to me science is like a tightrope walker. Because the goal when you're a tightrope walker is to never look at your feet, because as soon as you do, you realize how high up you are, you realize you're in midair and that you may fall a long way down. But as long as you look straight forward, if you're walking a tightrope, you usually can walk safely across. And the reason for that is because you don't want to look down. You need to just keep looking forward, keep plugging ahead, and that's what science is doing. Science does not want to look at its foundations. They don't want to look at, and you can call it the body of science if you want. I'm talking about the people involved in it. They certainly don't want to look down. They do not want to explore their foundations, because if they did and they found a crack, that could collapse the entire thing. So they don't want to look down. They're just like a tightrope walker. But let's get on to the quotes, okay? So I started out with some that I'm just calling prime importance. And by the way, this video might be long. I've got over 100 quotes to read, and some of them are quite long. So either bear with me, or if you need to watch this in segments, you can do that. But my goal is to hit every one of these quotes today, and that's what we'll be doing. And then we'll read some super chats, and then we'll go to bed. So let's go to the first quote I thought was interesting here. Nietzsche had to say, quote, "Where has God gone?" He cried, "I shall tell you, we have killed him. You and I, we are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whether it is moving now, whether we are moving now, away from all suns, are we not perpetually falling? Backward, sideward, forward in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is it not more and more night coming all the time? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? Gods, too, decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, console ourselves?" End quote. Let's go on to the next quote. Just some little topic quotes here. Like I said, prime importance quotes. This is Leo Tolstoy. Quote, "I know that most men, including those at ease with problems of the greatest complexity, can seldom accept even the simplest and most obvious truth, if it be such as would oblige them to admit their falsity of the conclusions which they have delighted in explaining to their colleagues, which they have proudly taught to others, and which they have woven thread by thread into the fabric of their lives." End quote. So, comment on this quote here is just simply exactly what I say about people like Neil deGrasse and Bill Nye. These men who have the ease, the greatest of ease at explaining the great complexity of the universe. They make it sound so simple, so easy. Oh, we figured it all out. But they can seldom accept even the slightest and most obvious truth, if it would be one that would oblige them to admit the falsity of their conclusions, which they have delighted in. They explain it to their colleagues, and they've taught it to others. They go to auditoriums and speak about it, and they have, had it woven thread by thread into the fabric of their lives. Leo Tolstoy. So, again, hopefully you understand why that quote is there. Let's get into a little more detailed ones. We got Fred Hoyle here, who said, "The history of science shows that each generation finds the universe to be stranger than the preceding generation ever conceived it to be." Next, we have Phil Platt. Many people have heard of him, right? The bad astronomer. What did he have to say? Well, you might take note here. He said, "I have two things to say that might surprise you. First, geocentrism is a valid frame of reference. And second, heliocentrism is not any more or less correct." Stop and think, ladies and gentlemen. Think to yourself, if one cannot be more correct than the other, why are you laughed at if you say the earth stands still? Why is it being taught to children every single day in this world that the earth absolutely goes around the sun? Let's continue reading, and by the end of this, you're going to be baffled with the amount of scientists that say the exact same thing. It's the exact same frame. It's just a different frame of reference. There is no better model than the other, and yet one is being taught as absolute, complete, and total fact. Why? Because the other one might invoke a creator, might explain creation, might place importance on the earth. Let's continue. We've got George Ellis, and man, have I read this quote a million times. Let's read it again. Quote, "People need to be aware that there is a range of models that can explain the observations. For instance, I can construct you a spherically symmetrical universe with Earth at its center, and you cannot disprove it based on your observations. You can only exclude it on philosophical grounds. In my view, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I want to bring into the open is the fact that we are using philosophical criteria in choosing our models. A lot of cosmology tries to hide that." End quote. George Ellis, a premier physicist in the world. And let's just comment on this real quick so you can go back and understand what he's saying here. This was a huge quote to me. People who have listened to me know that I read this every other show I do, because I was taught in school, science is all about truth. So, science doesn't lie. Science just is an unbiased observer. It's observations. But yet we see George Ellis tell us that he wants to bring out into the open that the fact that we are using philosophical criteria in choosing our models. A lot of cosmology, which is science, this is a branch of science, tries to hide that. So there's a branch of science out there trying to hide something from people? What do you mean? How could that be possible? Why is science trying to hide anything from me? Well, he's explaining exactly what he's telling you. They are choosing which model based on philosophical criteria. And he says, now, to him, there's nothing wrong with that. Well, great. That's his opinion. I don't care what he thinks, whether or not there's something wrong with that. But he tells people, what I want to bring out in the open is the fact that we're using this in choosing our models and that we're trying to hide that. I mean, you're going to learn by the end of this video the exact reason why. And the reason why is these guys cannot stand, and I don't want to say these guys because George Ellis is different. George Ellis is somebody who does try and place the earth back at the center because, well, all observations show that it is. Yeah, pretty brilliant, right? I mean, that's what an unbiased science observer would say. When all the tests prove that the earth is fixed and that things are moving away from us and that we are the center of the universe, then that's what it is. Except for if you have a worldview that says, no, we cannot be the center. I hate that idea. I can't stand it. It goes against everything I am. I don't want to be important. I don't want to have a God. I don't want to be part of creation. And then all of a sudden, you will have cosmology trying to hide the fact that there is no difference between the two models. Okay, let's continue. Another George Ellis quote. Quote, this assumption is made because it is believed to be unreasonable that we should be near the center of the universe. End quote. Okay, comment on that. Again, we just talked about this. It's the assumption. Okay, so remember, we're talking about science. Why are we making assumptions? The assumption is made because it is believed to be unreasonable that we should be near the center of the universe. Who cares what you believe should be unreasonable? No, they just choose that because they're afraid of the fact that we could be the center. They would rather anything else be true, and they will use any other concoction or formula or hypothesis they can, as long as it means that the Earth is not the center. Let's continue. And we've got Arthur S. Otis in his book, quote, in the effort to explain the Michelson-Morley experiment, the thought was advanced that the Earth might be stationary. Such an idea was not considered seriously, since it would mean in effect that our Earth occupied the omnipotent position in the universe with all other heavenly bodies paying homage by revolving around it. Again, this is why I loaded the beginning of this these quotes with these, just so you could see exactly what I'm trying to point out here, that these guys said not such an idea was not considered seriously. Why? If all the observations, if you're a scientist and the tests and experiments and observations tell you that you're the center of the universe, it is not okay to say, well, we're not going to consider that seriously because we don't want to be the center. Ridiculous. Let's continue. We got a Stephen Hawking quote coming up next. Quote, the universe might look the same in every direction as seen from any other galaxy too. This, as we have seen, was Friedman's second assumption. We have no scientific evidence for or against this assumption. We believe it only on the grounds of modesty. End quote. Stephen Hawking. Hopefully you understand what's going on here again. Stephen Hawking explains it on the grounds of modesty. But if you're choosing your worldview, then that is the opposite of modesty. You're choosing what you like, not what science is telling you, not what experiments are showing you, not what observations are showing you. You're choosing instead, well, we change what we see based on the fact that we want to be modest. That's not being modest. That's the opposite. That's being holy hell conceited like I've never seen before. That you are able to change science? You are able to change observations and experiments? Crazy. Let's continue. Edwin Hubble. I've read this many times too. Let's read it full. Quote, such a condition would imply that we occupy a unique position in the universe, analogous in a sense to the ancient conception of a central Earth. This hypothesis cannot be disproved, but it is unwelcome and would only be accepted as a last resort in order to save the phenomenon. Therefore, we disregard this possibility. The unwelcome position of a favored location must be avoided at all costs. Such a favored position is intolerable. Therefore, in order to restore homogeneity and to escape the horror of a unique position, it must be compensated by spatial curvature. There seems to be no other escape. Now remember, Edwin Hubble, the one who coined the phrase the Big Bang, the one who told everybody, oh, all these galaxies are moving away from us, which certainly places you in the center of the universe. How else could everything be moving away from you? Well, what did he come up with? He said, well, wait. What if the universe and the planet and everything that we know is on a balloon? And as you blow up the balloon, technically, everything on that balloon gets further away from each other. Picture a balloon, put a bunch of dots on it, and start to blow it up. Now, pay no attention to who's actually blowing up the balloon of space, because that's what they call the expanding universe, and people might understand where that came from. This is why the universe has to be expanding, is simply because otherwise we're at the center of the universe. But they don't want that. So they say, no. We're in a balloon. We're on a balloon. It's being blown up. We're all moving away from each other, and everyone, no matter where you're at in the universe, would all see the same thing, everything moving away from you. Again, never been proven. Never been shown. It's pseudoscience. Hopefully you understand that. That's Edwin Hubble in his book from 1937. But again, look at how many... This quote is just so full of nonsense. Remember, this is a scientist who's making observations and saying, well, this condition would imply that we occupy a unique position. This hypothesis cannot be disproved. Okay? Remember what's being taught in school. Remember what you get laughed at for saying. If you dare say the sun goes around the earth, you will be laughed at However, I'm about to read you 100 quotes that tell you that we're right in the center. Okay, so this hypothesis cannot be disproved. Okay, so why is it laughed at? Well, because it's unwelcome. Okay, good for you. What the difference does that make? Therefore, we disregard this possibility. What do you mean you're disregarding? If something cannot be disproved and you're disregarding it? Holy smokes. Why are you disregarding it? Because it's the unwelcomed position of a favored location, and it must be avoided at all costs. Ladies and gentlemen, please listen to my words here and understand what's going on. You have to look at this and you have to understand that they're saying that the hypothesis cannot be disproved that we're the center, but it's unwelcomed, and we're going to disregard it because it's an unwelcome position of a favored location, and it must be avoided at all costs. This is not science, ladies and gentlemen. This is the opposite of it. Such a favored position is intolerable. It's intolerable. What is that word when we're talking about science and observations and, oh, well, I don't want to be in the center. It's intolerable, so let's make up whatever other nonsense. And what other nonsense do I mean? I mean the whole universe model that they've given you. This is what they've come up with. Because why? Because the alternative, saying we're the center, must be avoided at all costs. Such a favored position is intolerable. Therefore, in order to restore homogeneity and to escape the horror of a unique position, this is science. This is what scientists believe, that we have to escape the horror of a unique position. So let's just make up a bunch of shit like we're on a balloon. Let's just do that. There seems to be no other escape. Wow. Let's go to Einstein from The Evolution of Physics, page 212. Quote, "The struggle, so violent in the early days of science between the views of Ptolemy and Copernicus, would then be quite meaningless. Either coordinate system could be used with equal justification. The two sentences, the sun is at rest and the earth moves, or the sun moves and the earth at rest, would simply mean two different conventions concerning two different coordinate systems." So there's Einstein telling you that, well, whether the earth is the center or whether the sun's the center or whatever, it doesn't matter. You could pick Mars. You could pick whatever you want. You could pick any light in the sky and say, oh, now this is the center. Big deal. But what do they choose? They choose the sun. Why? Well, they worship it. Let's go to the next one. Quote, "There is no planetary observation by which we on Earth can prove that the Earth is moving in an orbit around the sun." End quote. Physicist I. Bernard Cohen. Again, what more do I need to say here, folks? No explanation needed here. There's no planetary observation which can prove that we move around the sun, but it's taught in schools as fact, and it's called science, and people will run around and tell you it's scientifically proven. Good for them. How about Sir Isaac Newton? Quote, "Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but my greatest friend is truth. Truth is ever to be found in simplicity and not in the multiplicity and confusion of things." Oh boy, would that guy be turning in his grave today. They've simply destroyed anything simple and come up with the biggest nonsense theories and ad hoc explanations and pseudoscience that you've ever seen in your life. Let's go with Kepler here. Quote, "I demonstrate by means of philosophy that the earth is round and is inhabited on all sides, that it is insignificantly small, and it is born through the stars." End quote. Johannes Kepler. I just thought it was funny to point out here that the words philosophy is in there. You demonstrate by means of philosophy? Way to be a scientist, guys. Way to go. It's the best science term I've ever heard. I demonstrate by means of I demonstrate by means of philosophy. Oh boy, this is classic. This is good stuff. We're barely probably 10 quotes into the 100 that you got coming. Enjoy yourselves. Let's go with Edwin Hubble from the Monthly Notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, 1937. Quote, "If the redshifts are a Doppler shift, the observations as they stand lead to the anomaly of a closed universe, curiously small and dense, and it may be added, suspiciously young." So, very interesting. And no real comment needed there. I mean, his redshifts that he said are the reason is because galaxies are moving away from us. But if instead they're a Doppler shift, well, then all of a sudden we live in a closed universe. It's small, it's dense, and suspiciously young. What are we told today? Oh, universe is 14 point something billion years old, and this is fact. We can rewind the clock of the sky. Just rewind it. Rewind it back to 1/10 of a 1,000th of a millionth of a second, and we could see how everything came into play. This is great. Let's go to the next one. Another Edwin Hubble from the Observational Approach to Cosmology on page 63. Quote, "Thus the theory might be valid provided the universe were packed with matter to the very threshold of perception. Nevertheless, the ever-expanding model of the first kind seems rather dubious. It cannot be ruled out by the observations, but it suggests a forced interpretation of the data. The disturbing features are all introduced by the recession factors, by the assumption that red shifts are velocity shifts. The departure from a linear law of red shifts, the departure from uniform distribution, the curvature necessary to restore homogeneity, the excess material demanded by the curvature, each of these is merely the recession factor in another form. If the recession factor is dropped, if red shifts are not primarily velocity shifts, the picture is simple and plausible. There is no evidence of expansion and no restriction of the timescale, no trace of spatial curvature, and no limitation of spatial dimensions. Moreover, there is no problem of internebular material, and for those who don't know, internebular material is considered today's dark energy, dark matter. So if you understand this quote, you basically will understand that he's saying that, yeah, if we drop these recession factors and we don't consider these red shifts to be velocity shifts, then all of a sudden there is no evidence of expansion. There is no restriction of the timescale. There's no spatial curvature. There's no limitation of spatial dimensions, and there is no dark matter or dark energy. But all those things are included in the current model because they have to be if you want to believe what you're told about the universe. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. Again, I love to read things like this. The disturbing features are all introduced by the recession factors by the assumption. So again, all of their science is based on assumptions. And if they're faulty, then what? Well, we'll find out as more quotes come along. How about physicist James Coleman? Quote, "The easiest explanation was that the Earth was fixed in the ether and that everything else in the universe moved with respect to the Earth and the ether. Such an idea was not considered seriously, since it would mean in effect that our Earth occupied the omnipotent position in the universe with all other heavenly bodies paying homage by moving around it." Again, it's telling you what the easiest explanation is for the data, for the observations, for the real science, for the tests, for the experiments. However, such an idea was not considered seriously, since it might mean that we're the center. We might mean we're important. When guys look around the universe, even if you believe like the heliocentrists believe and all these other, there's no life anywhere. There's nothing going on anywhere. And yet he says it's not considered seriously because it would mean in effect that our Earth occupied the omnipotent position in the universe. Well, what's wrong with that? What? It's your worldview. It's their worldview. Let's go on to the next one by Ernst Mach. Quote, "All masses, all motion, indeed all forces are relative. There is no way to discern relative from absolute motion when we encounter them. Whenever modern writers infer an imaginary distinction between relative and absolute motion from a Newtonian framework, they do not stop to think that the Ptolemaic and the Copernican are both equally true." End quote. I don't know what else I need to tell you besides they're teaching one in school. They do not even fathom the thought that we could be the center, and everything I'm about to read to you tonight will prove otherwise. It will tell you that it's an equally true position to place yourself in, but look at the nature of our world. Look at what's happened to our world, and then think, well, what if everybody knew that we were the center? What if everybody knew how important Earth is? Would that change their perspective? People just care. I'm going to go with Elon Musk to Mars. It's going to be great. And they can't put a camera on the moon for God knows what reason. But again, let's just continue on. Here we go. This is, we'll just read the whole quote. Quote, "It is shown that the cosmological interpretation of redshift in the spectra of quasars leads to yet another paradoxical result, namely that the Earth is the center of the universe." End quote. Got another quote from the same person. "The Earth is indeed the center of the universe. The arrangement of quasars on certain spherical shells is only with respect to the Earth. These shells would disappear if viewed from another galaxy or quasar. This means that the cosmological principle will have to go. Also, it implies that a coordinate system fixed to the Earth will be the preferred frame of reference in the universe. Consequently, both the special theory and general theory of relativity must be abandoned for cosmological purposes." End quote. Y.P. Varshny. Give you the book here. You need to read this quote again. I'll be here all night if I go through each quote word for word, but you just need to understand what he's saying here, that based on the observations now all of a sudden, it means that the cosmological principle will have to go. And we're about 2 quotes away from getting to the cosmological principle and the Copernican principle. I'll be reading those for you. It just tells you right here. "And consequently, all the theories of relativity must be abandoned, but yet today it's being taught as fact." Let's go to the next one. Physicist Richard Wolfson. Quote, quote, if the Earth, isn't moving relative to the ether, then Earth alone among the cosmos is at rest relative to the ether. Now, that may be an absurd possibility, but maybe it's true. I think you can see that this is not going to be very philosophically satisfying, and it isn't satisfying physically either. But it violates the Copernican principle that the Earth isn't special. It is particularly absurd in light of what we know from modern cosmology, namely that there are places in the universe, distant galaxies in particular, that are moving away from us at speeds very close to the speed of light. It's absurd to imagine that everything in the universe is pinned to Earth when there are such a wide range of speeds relative to Earth throughout the universe, but it suffices to rule it out on this philosophical ground. End quote. So again, this is a very important quote, and we're going to be talking about the Copernican principle here shortly. And again, this is just funny what they say. I think you can see that this is not going to be very philosophically satisfying. And again, now this may be an absurd possibility. Why is it absurd? Because of the worldview of these scientists. Again, if you want to believe in them and their worldview, be my guest. I choose not to. One more quote of prime importance here. This is Albert Einstein in his Kyoto address, How I Created the Theory of Relativity. He says, I have come to believe that the motion of the Earth cannot be detected by any optical experiment, though the Earth is revolving around the sun. End quote. There's no more definition of pseudoscience than this right here. Okay? There's no experiment. However, my belief. That's what he's saying. Yeah, well, I've come to believe that there is no motion, there is no experiment that can prove that the Earth moves. However, the Earth revolves around the sun. Oh boy, it's pseudoscience. That's all it is. All right, let's move on to the Copernican principle. And I'm going to be reading this from Wikipedia. The Copernican principle. In physical cosmology, the Copernican principle is an alternative name for the principle of relativity, stating that humans on Earth or in the solar system are not privileged observers of the universe. Named for Copernican heliocentrism, it is a working assumption that arises from a modified cosmological extension of Copernicus's argument of moving Earth. In some sense, it's equivalent to the mediocrity principle. Let's read what the mediocrity principle is. The mediocrity principle is the philosophical notion that if an item is drawn at random from one of several sets or categories, it's likelier to come from the most numerous category than from any of the less numerous categories. The principle has been taken to suggest that there is nothing very unusual about the evolution of the solar system, Earth's history, the evolution of biological complexity, human evolution, or any one nation. It is a heuristic in the vein of the Copernican principle and is sometimes used as a philosophical statement about the place of humanity. The idea is to assume mediocrity rather than starting with the assumption that a phenomenon is special, privileged, exceptional, or even superior. But again, as I just stated, look at the universe around you, look everywhere, and where do you see life? Where do you see importance? Where do you see nature? Where do you see growth? Where do you see all these things happen here on Earth? So when someone says there's nothing very unusual about the evolution of the solar system, Earth's history, the evolution of it is, what are you talking about? It's extremely unusual. It's of prime importance. Let's continue. This is the back to the Copernican principle from Wiki. Hermann Bondi named the principle after Copernicus in the mid-20th century, although the principle itself dates back to the 16th and 17th century paradigm shift away from the Ptolemaic system, which placed the Earth at the center of the universe. Copernicus proposed that the motion of the planets can be explained by reference to an assumption that the Sun and not the Earth is centrally located and stationary. He argued that the apparent retrograde motion of the planets is an illusion caused by Earth's movement around the Sun, which the Copernican model placed at the center of the universe. Copernicus himself was mainly motivated by technical dissatisfaction with the earlier system and not by support for any mediocrity principle. In fact, although the Copernican heliocentric model is often described as demoting Earth from its central role it had in the Ptolemaic geocentric model, it was successors to Copernicus, notably the 16th century Giordano Bruno, who adopted this new perspective. The Earth's central position had been interpreted as being in the lowest and filthiest parts. Instead, as Galileo said, the Earth is part of the dance of the stars, rather than the sump where the universe's filth and ephemera collect. In the late 20th century, Carl Sagan asked, "Who are we?" We find that we live on an insignificant planet of a humdrum star, lost in a galaxy tucked away in some forgotten corner of the universe, in which there are far more galaxies than people. I'm going to end that quote there. Just because I want to make a comment on this. Of course, we've all heard Carl Sagan say this, but even after just the few quotes I've already read, do you understand the problem here? That scientifically speaking, you can't discount the Earth being the center. Yet here comes Carl Sagan, the science pusher, the science popularist, who says, who are we? We find ourselves that we live on an insignificant planet of no, that's your worldview. So thank you for pushing your worldview on us, on me, on my children, on all children across the world. It's beautiful. Really, really tremendous for you. In cosmology, if one assumes the Copernican principle and observes that the universe appears isotropic, or that the same in all directions from a vantage point of Earth, then one can infer that the universe is generally homogeneous, or the same everywhere at any given time, and is also isotropic about any given point. These two conditions make up the cosmological principle. In practice, astronomers observe that the universe has heterogeneous or non-uniform structures up to the scale of galactic superclusters, filaments, and great voids. It becomes more and more homogeneous and isotropic when observed at larger and larger scales with little detectable structure on scales of more than about 200 million parsecs. However, on scales comparable to the radius of the observable universe, we see systematic changes with distance from Earth. For instance, galaxies contain more young stars and are less clustered, and quasars appear more numerous. While this might suggest that the Earth is the center of the universe, the Copernican principle requires us to interpret it as evidence for the evolution of the universe with time. This distant light has taken almost the age of the universe to reach Earth and shows the universe when it was young. The most distant light of all, cosmic microwave background radiation, is isotropic to at least 1 part in 1,000. Modern mathematical cosmology is based on the assumption that the cosmological principle is almost but not exactly true at the largest scales. The Copernican principle represents the irreducible philosophical assumption needed to justify this, when combined with the observations. Michael Rowan Robinson emphasizes in the Copernican principle as the threshold test for modern thought, asserting that it is evident that in the post-Copernican era of human history, no well-informed or rational person can imagine that the Earth occupies a unique position in the universe. Unbelievable. This is all from Wikipedia, Copernican principle. You can read it yourself. I just copied it over and highlighted a few important parts. Again, they say, oh, well, this might suggest that the Earth is at its center. The Copernican principle, the principle itself, this is not scientific, this is an assumption. We saw earlier George Ellis saying that the assumption is made because they don't want to be in the center, and it's saying the Copernican principle requires us to interpret it as evidence for what? The principle of something requires us to, oh boy. It's crazy here. This last sentence here, talking about the Copernican principle, represents the irreducible philosophical assumption needed to justify this when combined with the observations. Notice it's irreducible philosophical assumption. This is not science. This is pseudoscience. The beliefs that we have been taught are not actual science. They're not scientific. Let's continue on here. This is just no particular quote. I think I wrote it, or no, I had a, so I said, what is the basis of the modern science and technology? Because according to science establishment historians, heliocentrism is of course the cause. An online encyclopedia put it this way, quote, the scientific revolution can be roughly dated as having begun in 1543, the year in which Nicholas Copernicus published his De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium. However, the origins of much modern technology can be traced back, end quote. That was the end of the encyclopedia quote. Now I'm speaking. However, the origins of much modern technology can be traced back to the elaborate mechanical devices that sprung up in post-medieval Europe. Those toys are an outgrowth of medieval craft of clockmaking, and that craft, in turn, was an offshoot of the craft of applying complex mechanical technology for the purpose of astronomy-related needs. These devices were unambiguously geocentric, every one of them. This is something that even the researchers of the Antikythera mechanism, which you can see pictured below, who mostly are believers of a heliocentric model of the universe, assert, perhaps grudgingly. They obviously don't want everyone to know that devices like this ancient piece of clockwork expose the ancient roots of modern technology. This Antikythera mechanism is based off a geocentric model. Okay? So they don't want you to know that they were able to predict everything, from eclipses to equinoxes, everything, from a geocentric point of view. They had no idea that, we're flying through the endless space and nonsense. So now I want to read, as we continue on, about the Copernican principle. This is the very interesting thing, and I think did I include pictures here? Yeah. Just to show you, this is the actual pictures from Copernicus's book on the revolution of the heavenly spheres, or whatever you want to call it. But there's a very interesting passage at the beginning of this book, and you'll see here it says ad lectorum de hypo, which means basically to the reader of this hypothesis, I believe is probably the correct translation. And you'll notice down here, it gets down here, and then it's signed Vale. okay, which means goodbye in Latin. So the weird thing about this is it appeared in the beginning. It's the preface of Copernicus's book, but now we're told it's written by Andreas Osiander. The story is ridiculous. The story is that Copernicus, on his deathbed, gives his book to be published now. Okay, you can publish my masterwork. You can publish it now. And the person he gave it to went in, supposedly this Andreas Osiander, who happened to be stepping in for the real book publisher at the time. He steps in and writes a preface to the book, doesn't sign his name, makes it look like it's by Copernicus, and then publishes all the copies of the book, and Copernicus never knew that this statement was in the book. That's the actual belief nowadays. You got to be kidding me. And look, there's even a little drawing of the beginning of it, just like there is throughout the whole book. So, I mean, he went and did an additional drawing. He drew this when Copernicus drew the rest. It's just such a joke. But let's read what he said, because a lot of people quote this to Copernicus, and I can see why. But really, if you're quoting this, you should quote it to Andreas Osiander, because that's what we're told. That's what history says, that it was not Copernicus who wrote this, that somebody else was able to write the preface to his book and he didn't know about it. Give me a break. All right. To the reader, concerning the hypothesis of this work. There have already been widespread reports about the novel hypothesis of this work, to which declares that the earth moves whereas the sun is at rest in the center of the universe. Hence, certain scholars, I have no doubt, are deeply offended and believe that the liberal arts, which are established long ago on a sound basis, should not be thrown into confusion. But if these men are willing to examine the matter closely, they will find that the author of this work has done nothing blameworthy, for it is the duty of an astronomer to compose the history of celestial motions through careful and expert study. Then he must conceive and devise the causes of these motions or hypotheses about them. Since he cannot in any way attain to the true causes, he will adopt whatever suppositions enable the motions to be computed correctly from the principles of geometry for the future as well as the past. The present author has performed both these duties excellently, for these hypotheses need not be true or even probable. On the contrary, if they provide a calculus consistent with the observations, that alone is enough. Perhaps there is someone who is so ignorant of geometry and optics that he regards the epicycle of Venus as probable, or thinks that this is the reason why Venus sometimes precedes and sometimes follows the sun by 40 degrees or even more. Is there anyone who is not aware that from this assumption it necessarily follows that the diameter of a planet at perigee should appear more than 4 times, and at the body of a planet more than 16 times as great as the apogee? Yet this variation is refuted by the experience of every age. In this science there are some other no less important absurdities, which need not be set forth at the moment. For this art, it is quite clear, it is completely and absolutely ignorant of the causes of the apparent non-uniform motions. And if any causes are devised for the imagination, as indeed very many are, they are not put forward to convince anyone that they are true, but merely to provide a reliable basis for computation. However, since different hypotheses are sometimes offered for one and the same motion, for example, eccentricity of an epicycle for the sun's motion, the astronomer will take his first choice, the hypothesis which is the easiest to grasp. The philosopher will perhaps rather seek some semblance of truth, but neither of them will understand any state of anything certain unless it has been divinely revealed to them. Therefore, alongside the ancient hypotheses, which are no more probable, let us permit these new hypotheses also to become known, especially since they are admirable as well as simple, and bring with them a huge treasure of very skillful observations. So far as hypotheses are concerned, let no one expect anything certain from astronomy, which cannot furnish it, lest he accept as truth ideas conceived for another purpose, and depart from this study a greater fool than when he entered it. Farewell. Or goodbye, based on I think vale is goodbye in Latin. Anyway, when you find this online, you'll usually you'll see it signed XX, and then it will say that it's Andreas Osiander, but just read the book. It's not signed by anybody. It says goodbye, and then Nicholas Copernicus begins his book. So I guess somebody snuck in, put this preface in there, and then didn't tell Copernicus, and he died on his deathbed, which, you know, my beliefs on that, I don't think at all anybody publishes a book on their deathbed. It's just ridiculous. All right. So, I mean, you can go through and read that again. There's so much in this that would take me forever, but I think the most important part is simply the end. So far as hypotheses are concerned, let no one expect anything certain from astronomy, which cannot furnish it, lest he accept as truth. So are you somebody who accepts what Copernicus said is truth? Most people are. 99% of the world are. And the book tells you itself that if you accept it as truth, ideas conceived for another purpose, You will depart from this study a greater fool than when you entered it. 99% of the world fall into this exact statement right here. Sadly, I was one of them too. Man, I grew up my whole life believing that these things were true until I did the research, looked into it myself, studied these quotes, looked at what we're told, looked for the experiments, looked for the proof that we spin around the sun, and all of a sudden I realized exactly what you'll realize by the end of this video. There is none. Let's continue. I read this at the opening of the show. Quote, I have already known for a long time that we do not yet have proof for a system of Copernicus, but I shall not take the risk of being the first one to attack it. End quote. Alexander von Humboldt. Let's have the next quote here. Quote, dark energy is problematic. No one really knows what it is. We can make an educated guess and use quantum theory to estimate how much of it is there, and there might be, but then we overshoot by an astounding factor of 10 to the 120th. That is grounds enough, says George Ellis, to take a hard look at our assumptions about the universe and our place in it. If we analyze the supernova data, by assuming the Copernican principle is correct and get out something unphysical, I think we should start questioning the Copernican principle. Whatever our theoretical predictions are, they will in the end have to give way to the observational evidence. End quote. Real quick, I just want to comment on that part. George Ellis is basically saying if we get something unphysical, which is what dark matter is, which is what dark energy is, things that we can't observe, things that have never been noticed, but again, called scientific. But if these things are out there, then we need to look at the actual starting point. The starting point is exactly what we're discussing right now, the Copernican principle. We need to reassess it. Let's start a new quote. So what would it mean? The outcome were that the Copernican principle, So what would it mean if the outcome were that the Copernican principle is wrong? It would certainly require a seismic reassessment of what we know about the universe. If the Copernican principle fails, all that goes with that, the Big Bang, goes out the window too. Cosmology would be back at the drawing board. If we are in a void, answering how we came to be in such a privileged spot in the universe, it would be even trickier. And this is what you will learn by the end of this video. End quote, sorry. Marcus Chown is the earth at the heart of the cosmic void. Let's go to the next quote. Timothy Clifton from Oxford astrophysics member, PhD. Quote, a fundamental presupposition of modern cosmology is the Copernican principle, that we are not in a central or otherwise special region of the universe. Studies of type 1a supernova together with the Copernican principle have led to the inference that the universe is accelerating in its expansion. The usual explanation for this is that there must be a dark energy to drive the acceleration. Alternatively, it could be the case that the Copernican principle is invalid and that the data has been interpreted within an inappropriate theoretical framework. If we were to live in a special place in the universe, near the center of a void where the local matter density is low, then the supernova observations would be accounted for without the addition of dark energy. End quote. So again, I've talked about this before, and I've had people come at me and say, oh, prove what you're saying, prove what you're saying. I say, I'll show you several quotes that all admit that if the Earth is the center, it gets rid of everything, dark energy, dark matter, which currently is said to be 97% of the universe, or 95%. And it's never been observed. Guys, we're at what, 20 quotes now, 25 quotes? Is it obvious yet that we are being handed pseudoscience? I don't think there's any question about it. Again, what he's saying here is, well, it could be the case that the Copernican principle is invalid, which it absolutely is if you're basing it on observations, and that the data has been interpreted within an inappropriate theoretical framework. So let's continue. Remember, we're talking right now about the Copernican principle. I do have these things kind of separated out. We haven't even got to the experiments yet. We haven't even got to the fixed Earth yet. We haven't even got to the centrality of Earth yet. We still are on the Copernican principle. Let's continue. Jonathan I. Katz from The Biggest Bangs. His book is listed below here. Quote, the uniform distribution of burst arrival directions tells us that the distribution of gamma ray burst sources in space is a sphere or spherical shell with us at the center. Some other extremely contrived and implausible distributions are also possible. But Copernicus taught us that we are not in a special preferred position in the universe. Earth is not at the center of the solar system, the sun is not at the center of the galaxy, and so forth. There is no reason to believe we are the center of the distribution of gamma ray bursts. If our instruments are sensitive enough to detect the bursts at the edge of the spatial distribution, then they should not be isotropic on the sky, contrary to observation. If our instruments are less sensitive, then the end of the S3/2, I don't know what that is, law should hold, also contrary to observation. That is the Copernican dilemma. To this day, after the detection of several thousand bursts and despite earnest efforts to show the contrary, no deviation from a uniform random distribution, which is isotropy, in the direction of gamma ray bursts on the sky has ever been convincingly demonstrated. Again, these guys are admitting that there is no experiments or tests that prove what they're trying to prove. Okay? They just are able to explain it away, and we'll talk about that here shortly. Physicist Richard Wolfson, quote, "So if the Earth is at rest relative to the ether, then it alone is at rest. That makes us pretty special. Do you really want to return to a parochial pre-Copernican ideas? Do you really think you and your planet are so special that in all the rich vastness of the universe, you alone can claim to be at rest?" End quote. Well, I particularly do, because this is all I've seen. All I get from you is pictures from space of Pluto with the dog Pluto on him. I mean, what are you talking about? The Earth is all there is, folks. Let's continue. Richard Liu, here's his quote. Quote, "Cosmology is not even astrophysics. All the principal assumptions in this field are unverified or unverifiable in the laboratory, and researchers are quite comfortable with inventing unknowns to explain the unknown. How then could, after 50 years of failed attempts in finding dark matter, the fields of dark matter, dark energy have become so lofty priorities in astronomy funding to the detriment of all other branches of astronomy? I demonstrate in this article that while some of this is based upon truth, at least just as much of the, I believe that's cosmic microwave background, I might have wrote that wrong, cosmology has been propped up by a paralyzing amount of propaganda which suppress counter-evidence and subdue competing models. I believe astronomy is no longer heading towards a healthy future unless funding agencies rethink their master plans by backing away from such a high emphasis on groping in the dark." End quote. Let's move on here. We got Hawking and Ellis when they wrote their book in 73. Such